Welcome, everyone. I am Kent Parker here with my uh, director, Miss Sarah Melton. I am an intensive teaching classroom teacher in the school district of Oconee County, and she is at the moment she's the special education coordinator, but then she will be assuming a role as an assistant principal at one of our elementary schools. Um, what is an intensive teaching classroom? It is in our county, and I think we have several of them around the state now. They are classrooms for our pretty much lowest 0.1% of the population with really intense need. I mean, it's going to be students who have kind of round the clock supervision needs, who need extensive support during their functional skill training, and just difficulty maintaining attention and those types of things. A lot of intellectual disabilities and autism, pretty much the primary disability. That those are both for the students that I teach. I'm going to detail for you basically the examples from one student for the job application assessment that I use. In fact, I had two that started out that we're going to go through this objective and to be able to fill out a job application template. But only one of them ended up completing it because it was just a little bit more advanced than the other peer was able to do. So we'll talk about that in a minute, and a high common, what I call a high common element form that was created based on work that I had done many years ago as a doctoral student, and then continued on in my first few years back in the schools, and now I actually use it for behavior. Um, then we'll talk about a rubric. It's a paragraph writing rubric for another child who, again, and my students don't really write. I should say, they can speak their information and they can be prepared for an interview, but we also have them, for the most part, copy or find phrases, help them to paraphrase, and then we'll create a model, and then they kind of take it and run with it, but then they still are required to write something. For these two students, they were required to write something that was not about death or the computer games, something to expand their ability to have a conversation. And actually, by the end of the year, yes, they were able to talk about other things because we just really described what that was like to talk about things that were positive and uplifting, like getting a job. So I'll show you that rubric that we used, and then the last one is a task analysis for some adult hygiene. Now, all of you who are interested in this presentation probably have this down pat, but what we know is often the IEP data may not represent the sensitive nature of the learning of the students that I'm describing here. That the steps or the component parts of a task may not be measured appropriately and or may not be addressed in terms of the context of all the other steps in the actual objective. So just kind of show you what I had on these three types of areas. They are authentic data, so you have to ignore the spelling errors. There are little blips on those, and but again, did them on my computer. But, we used them, and I'm talking we, my assistants and I did for the students. So please ignore those. But I wanted to show you because the data went um, from these forms on to and into their present levels and their progress reports. So, okay. Okay, so first one is the job application personal information assessment. The objective was given a teacher-made 20-item curriculum-based assessment of personal information on a job application form. Ryan will improve the completion of the form from a baseline of 8 out of the 20, 40%, to 16 out of the 20 for 80%. And all the responses independent by the end of the third quarter. And again, he used kind of a modified ID sheet that had the information on there that we've been working on, it seemed like forever. And but we wanted him to know what those things were and be able to address them. And he is, for the most part, was able to fill them out. Now, it took a long time for him not to write what he wanted to write. He often wrote, sometimes for his last school attended, he would write the Batman Who Laughs, for example. He knows how to write that, but he just couldn't. Even though he had the cheat sheet, he just got off the target that way. But it was quite a job to get him to do better, and he did. So anyway, so you see that's the objective. Lots of people have different opinions about objectives. This is just the one that was easy for us to use. Okay. This is the next slide is the example of the sheet. Now, again, it's not a real application, wasn't taken from anywhere. It was taken from many things. And it's a high common element work and research where you look at a selection of different items, whether it's job applications or recipe instruction or playing some sports. All of those things, by the way, you can use pictures for recipes, especially, and task analyze those. But it's what you want to look for are the common elements or the elements common to those forms. And that's what we did here. Or if you're doing recipes, it's the elements that are common to the recipes you're trying to teach kids or the skills you're trying to teach them. Anyway, all of them, of course, had a name on them, an address, a phone, the name of the last school attended, which this is the first time I've done this, and that was one of the things that was on all of them. Don't know why it hadn't been, they hadn't seen it that much before. It's on everyone I ever did. And then special experience. All of our students at the high school do engage in recycling once a week for the rest of the school, and they wash out the trash bins and things like that for the custodians. So they do those kinds of things, and so that's kind of what I taught them to be their work experience. Even some of them, I let them write down that they ran errands from room 129 because that's what they did. They had a time of day. If they were doing okay, they could run an errand for me. Now, again, supervised because of the kinds of kids I work with, but they did that. Then work experience, of course, all of those, that's pretty much standard. So, and they would, again, that's what they put for us. Whoops, went too far. So this whole thing had like 20 different items that they needed to be able to recall or to copy. And that was perfectly okay. And there should have been another sheet. Maybe that didn't get on there.
I think you just put a screenshot of the top half of it in the presentation. But I was going to point out too that your actual one that the students were working on, you had formatted a little bit more to look like a application. But when it got pulled over, the formatting
you have the idea. You probably have plenty of these, and maybe unique to your area. You could even, figure out some of the manufacturers and the stores in your area, and you can make it look like that. So now, again, my students would probably need a job coach, maybe be able to go in and do some kind of partial participation in this skill. But, we have to think that they're going to be in a lesser restrictive environment, and that would still be safe for them. So you can't say, well, they're still working on their name and address. For the students that I teach, you have to be able to think. I could not get up in the morning and go in there if I didn't think that there was something they could do that was typical of kids at their age group. And so for me, that's really important and kind of what drives working with this student to give them more options at the time. Now, what's going to happen to them in adult services later, I wish I had control over that, but I really don't. And I know if you're teaching these kids, we may all have different experiences with them. So anyway, this is the form, and they get scored accordingly to whether they get so many out of 20 or not based on that objective. And again, most of the time we try to do these assessments once every week because that's what we worked on, but not every day. But every 2 weeks, I kind of set it up to be every 2 weeks, but some of them need a bit more sensitive measures, and depending on their absences, because they're absent quite a bit, so that made a big difference.
Did you have them handwrite or type those?
I had them handwrite, and then they went in to type them. And so they, the two students that started out were able to do the typing, and they liked it because if they can play games, do their gamings and things like that, they're able to keyboard. In fact, they can keyboard much better than I do. As you can tell, I've got Sarah here with me. But that was a big deal and a big thing in the work here with them is there's no reason why they can't have a replacement behavior for some of that dark fantasy that they use of being something more productive. And so, yes, that especially is true of this paragraph writing. True on the job application too, and that's particular to the kid you just saw, Ryan. The last objective is that he really had to come out of that dark world. You know, he's all nothing wrong with it if you like black and red or whatever, but he was really into monsters and masks and ghosts, and I don't remember what he gets. Anyway, what he got me for a present one time was the ghost face. I have no idea what it was, but I think he's a pretty bad character. So anyway, but he thinks about him, and that's his only real reinforcer. So it's kind of hard for one of these kids to just take that totally away. But it started interfering with his socialization in a PE class where he had lots of typical peers that were helpers, and he would just get really start living the part of those characters, which people mistook if they didn't know about those parts. And so we really had to back up and replace some of the language and some of his conversation skills. Okay. So with this child, this is kind of how we measured him. And he would have written or told us sentences that he wanted to use, or we would go in and do some work on the internet to find topics that sort of matched or answering questions. And he went through a process of brainstorming. I have a sheet that I use in this unit, and all of you can create them, a brainstorming activity. And he would write what he wanted to call the title of the writing. We used information from the ReadWorks assessment to pull topics from that were more related to science and some art he liked, and we would read those together, and we'd have to have him remember, what he could say about those things that didn't involve the fantasy world. So he did that, and then I would write them or type them out for him, and then he would help to put them in the right place and would punctuate them. He did learn to do the basic ending punctuation and capital letters. Believe me, he knows that because he used to capitalize every letter in his writing. But he's learned not to. He's learned now that the beginning of a sentence and one idea is what we need. So anyway, you can see that on this rubric. It's a 27-pointer is what it ends up being, and he does locate the information. We kind of guide him on that, and then we have him find the main idea of what he wanted to say based on his brainstorming sheet. What is this about? And then he had to say why it was interesting to him. based on what we'd read. And he would put that up next. And then there are 3 details about it. And some of it, I mean, it was at least 3 details. They may not be what I had picked or anybody else, that they were his 3 details from working on that and hearing us read it. And then to put it in somewhat of a logical order. And what that typically involved was that the closing wasn't at the beginning. So that was it. And yes, he could read. So it was, probably 7th, 8th grade, but he could read it. And then the clearly constructed sentences really meant no run-ons, because he didn't do punctuation until we taught him to do that. And then ending punctuation, the same thing. And then he learned really well to do the capitalization of proper nouns. And then he had to email his final one to me. And so that's the rubric we measured him on. And then I had, I think we attached the graph for his data here out of, all the times I measured him. Again, his was really about 2 weeks apart. Went on from really November to the end of the year. I think I had, it's about 18 weeks total. And it's, very slow, but he was making progress and really had a good time with it. In fact, it improved. It was just great for the assistants and I to hear him say, "Hey, we talked about that," whenever we would see something, on the screen, or if somebody brought something up. So, well, we talked about that, because in his case, he had a pretty good memory. So that is the paragraph writing rubric. And then again, you just kind of do a score count like the grade book. You just want to do it often. And because it's progress monitoring, you want to make instructional decisions as you go along. So, like I said, knowing through the baseline that, and seeing his writings from the past, knowing that he wrote in all capital letters, that they were all run-on sentences, and then he would switch back and forth from a topic to Batman or whatever else, Marvel characters out there. So he would do those things. So we had to kind of pare that down a little bit so it was a bit more on topic. So again, we all learned a lot from that. He did too. So that's the paragraph. Let me just move to this next little page here.
And one thing you mentioned to me before you started was how useful graphing that data might be for the student to see their progress.
Absolutely. And for him, it was pretty important, because he kept up with his grades and he wanted to know and have the feedback. So being able to tell him, that yesterday he had an 18, and then today he's getting a 25. And we would have to talk about, well, what changed? Can you find that? And, so he would know what he had to work on the next day. In fact, one of the assistants gave him a little Post-it note with, in today's writing, remember, you've got to do blah, 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 blah. Mm-hmm. Now, he might still omit the corrections for other things, but that wasn't the point, given the severity of his behavior and autism. So, but you could still measure how well he's doing, because, again, what we know is this is a replacement skill for the inappropriate topics that he wrote about. So he's not going to write a novel, I don't think. Now, it surprised me. I wouldn't sum him up that way. It wouldn't be functional for him to write a novel, but he can at least maybe talk about some other things that he's learning. And I remember reading one story on bridges in the United States, and he just took off on that. And he'd been to Philadelphia, he'd seen the bridge there, and there's been a lot of things that he knew, but we would never have known that. I don't think anybody would have ever known that had we not primed it. And so, I think that's going to go well for him. Okay. So the graphing of that really looks nice, because you have we just used to, plain little bar graph scored, and, wherever he scored, you clearly could see that he was doing a stair step to his goal. And the parents love that, and it's always recommended to do some kind of visual inspection of the data. Okay. So again, simple. I know this you guys probably do this all the time. It's just the presentation for the Academic Alliance is to get us to think more about it. Things that are you're doing that match that IEP objective. I read lots of IEPs, and I have all through my career that somehow or another the assessments don't really connect. Well, this for our kids, if you're working with intense kids, you don't have any other choice. You can't just go to the Brigance for everything you're teaching them. So it has to be individualized, and that's kind of my point.
And I like that for your students with the severe autism, you're connecting those academics to social skills, which is their even greater deficit that's going to hinder them from being successful post-school.
Absolutely. And it took a while to work with my assistants on the fact that you have to think replacement behavior. Mm-hmm. You have to think replacement behavior. So you couldn't just continue to say, no, we don't go down there and talk about XYZ to so-and-so. We really had to prime him with some other topics. Right. Sports was a big one too. Thank goodness that was more age appropriate, and for him was to talk about some sports and keeping up with that. I don't think he'd ever done that before he had to start kind of looking at the scores. So anyway, then the last one is a task analysis of the adult hygiene. As you can imagine, those of you out there teaching know that our students come with a variety of hygiene issues, and they're just not or haven't been independent on addressing that, whether it is, bathroom, bodily function hygiene, and I'm not just talking about bowel or bladder, I'm talking about picking the nose, those kinds of things. So had to really think that through, and I found some work done on that recently. And really the replacement skill is to teach them some main high common element hygiene practices. And so while we may not catch every instance of, a child picking his nose or sneezing on his arm or, doing other sensory touching, we could at least replace it with pro-social hygiene behaviors. And so, again, in looking at the students, and I think this is probably common across our population, they all have trouble wiping their face, looking at it, making sure the things are out of the little sleepers are out of their eyes, or if they've got food around their mouth from breakfast or from lunch. Most of our students had that issue. Their hands, they would use some sanitizer, but their hands really were a concern for the assistants and other people. And so brushing their teeth was very important, and that was important to parents. Just all of the parents said that was something they wish they could do independently. And then applying the deodorant because, parents are busy in the morning, they're trying to get to work and, that kind of thing. And so sometimes they weren't able to always help. So every time the kid got to school, the first thing they did was a hygiene check. And then about mid-morning, we would do another kind of abbreviated one. And then at lunch, once we came back, we'd start over again. And then in the afternoon, sometimes we'd get another one in, and then sometimes we wouldn't. Okay. But it was practice. And what we saw is, they still had these other behaviors, but they were much more amenable to being corrected and modeled to go get a tissue and to learn how to hold one nostril and blow. Those kinds of things. But our objective was really just taking care of their hygiene and to give them some of those practices that they could get reinforcement for. Certainly, and I believe this, and it's okay, that they will have to be prompted on the hygiene practices for quite some time yet. They're doing better, but they will still have to do that, especially some of the ones that are they're all really intense. Some are not independent at all, but some of them are learning it. So that's why you can read that objective. That's why I chose the assessment system for them that I did. You can see here that they had to, wash their face. They had to wash their hands, brush their teeth, and apply deodorant. And that's all we measured them on, because if we were working on that, they couldn't be picking their nose or whatever. And then some of them still did, but we just washed longer and gave them a quick little, redirection for that. So with this form, and you should have that, if we don't send it to you, we'll make sure we get to you. You should have the one with the data on it. You'll see that the way that we measured these, with either the child used the prompt they had to use was pointing to the picture, and it usually involved a visual too, a verbal too, but it was typically pointing to the deodorant pictures from the sticks. Is it? I think that's what I use. Symbol sticks. Yeah. We used the pictures from the symbol sticks, and we had some wall posters. Many of you probably have that too, but they're also attached to the handouts, where we could just try to point to, as soon as the child came in and put up their book bag, they could go into the restroom. And if they just stood there, which some of them did, we had to just kind of point to the picture, and then they might get started on this routine. And I call it a routine because it's 4 things. There's really a routine for each one of them. But to be complete in their trying to learn the independence of their hygiene, I wanted to be able to get through all 4 of them. To think hygiene, this first thing I do, hygiene check, is to do all 4 of these things. And so, yeah, they'd come in, they'd stand there. We just would have to point and get them to go through that. Okay. So the way that it's measured is like down at the bottom, you see the key. What I measured it by was a level of prompt. If you've not read up on that, I would suggest that you do, because you've got a system of least intrusive and a system of most intrusive prompts, where you start out with the most intrusive first and you build up. But what I did was a least intrusive. So the least intrusive prompt level was using a picture and pointing to it. And then we would do a verbal. Okay, David, what's next? It's washing your face. And then he would get into the routine, or we'd model it and he would do it. And then the next one that's a bit more intrusive is a gestural, because you're reaching into kind of the child's space. You're having to gesture to what to do and use that verbal as well. And if that didn't work, we'd have to get his attention and have to show him, or another student would show them how to put the toothpaste on the toothbrush and how to get started with that particular skill. So that would be more intrusive, because not only are you doing the verbal, you're also doing the modeling with him too. You're going to that one. And then there were students, and we still measure them because we have to know, and I'll tell you why in just a minute. We have to know that, hey, we did a hand over hand, or we touched them in some way. Had one pretty much all year that I had to lift his elbow so he could reach his armpit with the deodorant. He had no problem getting it, taking the lid off and holding the deodorant, not a problem. But he would pretty much do his chest instead of in the armpit. But I think with time he's going to be able to do that. So because he could do the other things, he just couldn't reach. He's a rather large guy, and so to reach around there really took some effort for him. So, but he could do it as long as I kind of lifted his elbow to do that. So what's important about this for us in this particular case with these kids was actually measuring the level of support they needed to learn these skills. So when you get the data sheet, you'll see that, there are kids that moved from, having the physical assists pretty much, predominantly throughout, to they moved to just having a gestural one. Or so you would kind of say that, okay, maybe they didn't master all of these, but they got a lesser intrusive prompt as they went through the year. So it became more natural and they became more independent. Did any of them become independent? Well, you probably already know the answer to that. No, because this is one of the skills they will need lifelong support. I believe they will, because having visited lots of group homes and seen where my students will probably transition to as far as their skills, this is that's probably what will be their transition coming up in our county. So, but again, we're embracing it and moving on with it, and parents wrap their head around it. They are very aware. So I feel okay about this. If they can partially participate in this, that's my goal.
And I would imagine for a lot of your kids, knowing their size, those kids were all probably as tall as you were.
Taller,
the parents probably considered it a big win that they were not having knockdown dragouts at home with these steps, that they were moving towards independence. That's kind of the language I always
They only
use.
halfway did it.
Right.
They would go through the motions, but not really brush their teeth.
Right.
Or wouldn't really wash their face. I had one, it took a while. He just brushed his chin. He was washing his face when he had the little face pad. He just did his chin, but he didn't get to all of it. He felt like he had done it.
Right.
So yeah. But that's the hygiene checklist. But again, the important part about that is it is really important to know the level of prompt they need. That helps communicate with parents that we're aware of the reality that for some students they're going to need physical prompts. That's what we do.
Right.
That's what we do. Some kids will do some pictures and have to have some physical prompts. That's what we found out from the data. Doesn't really matter to me as long as they're working on it and it lets me show some progress toward that goal.
All right.
Was that it?
That was it.
Well,
all right.
Nice having you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.